everyone. My name's Warner. My background's tech and cybersecurity. I help build a few tech companies across industries, including fintech, insurtech, and health tech. The health tech one was a unicorn. Most recently, I founded my company Gamma Force, where we help tech and health tech companies with cybersecurity strategy and different aspects of it as well. In this program, we talk with founders and executives who have done big things across tech. Today, I'm excited to welcome Joe Emison. Joe has certainly done some big things. As co-founder and CTO, he has scaled Branch Insurance to a unicorn as well. But first, we're going to talk about door games. I don't run across as many people who were involved in the pre-internet bulletin board systems. I used to run a board, so this is a favorite nerd subject for me. So, Joe, what's your tech origin story? How do you get into BBS games?
Yeah, I was 12 years old, maybe 11, and I enjoyed dialing into bulletin boards. I got a modem uh, when I got into middle school, and at the time, sort of pre-consumer internet, we you could dial up. These bulletin boards would have one or two lines, and they would only let one person on at a time. So you'd have your computer, you'd have a terminal. So nothing was graphical. It was all like, I remember it was a big deal when there were ANSI graphics over just the pure ASCII graphics. And so I would spend my time dialing into the, there might have been like five or six local bulletin boards. Um, and uh, and playing their games, which were like little text-based games. And There was a game called Legend of the Red Dragon by a guy named Seth Abel Robinson out of Salem, Oregon. And I was living in North Carolina at the time. And I really, he did a really good job. I mean, he designed it well, even though he wasn't like a graphic designer. This was all, in these ANSI text things. So I liked it a lot. So I dialed up his bulletin board and I started a conversation with him. And I think at the time he was like 17 or 18 and I was like 13, maybe 12, 13. And I was like, I want to write a game like that. And he was like, well, here's what you do. And so he suggested I learn Turbo Pascal. And I remember I would just keep going back to him and be like, hey man, like, will you look at this? Like, what do you think of my code? Like, whatever. So I guess he was like an initial mentor. He was very kind. He's always like, super helpful. He I don't think he graduated high school. He never went to college. He eventually moved to Japan and married a nice woman there, and he is like a software developer, independent software developer still today. I guess he must be like 50 now. So
That's so cool. You're talking to Seth. Believe it or not, there's still some Telnet BBSs out there. One
yeah,
is dedicated to Lord. I was running, well, playing as a participant, three concurrent different Lord games only a couple years ago. It was like scratching a gaming itch because it was relatively low time commitment. I have like a
yeah.
strategy guide I wrote for myself because I had to remind myself of all the tricks. Like, what was it? Throw the gold in the air in the forest and you lose
And
it.
it's so funny you say this. So I wrote so Seth introduced this concept of in-game modules or IGMs in this game Lord, and he also had another game called Planets: The Exploration of Space, which was sort of like a not as good version. It was like a little different. And so I wrote those. So I wrote these. I was like one of the more prolific writers of these in-game modules. And one of the things I wrote was something called Lord Net, which sounds deeply religious, but was a way that you could play Legend of the Red Dragon. So you would play on a bulletin board, you play against the other people who dialed into the bulletin board. But Lord Net would let you sort of combine with the people on your bulletin board and you would fight people on other bulletin boards. And it used FidoNet, which was a way of sending originally really messages, like message board messages between bulletin boards all over the world. And so we had a FidoNet based game called LordNet, and there was someone who wrote a guide to winning at LordNet, and it cost $15, and they published it, and I remember I was like, what is this? Like I hadn't built in the type of things that Seth had that were very sophisticated. And so I eventually bought it. I think I had to like call a 900 number to like get a code to buy it. And it was all just made up stuff. He just like made up a bunch of stuff and published it. It was kind of my first foray into like people just make stuff up and sell it to unwitting, gullible other people.
That's great. So you were the original author of LordNet?
LordNet, I wrote LordNet. I was the only author of LordNet.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, there was Bordas on that had LordNet. I remember that. I never ran it on my board, but and that was really cool. Um, yeah, and that's funny. We've never talked about this before. I always keep an ear to the ground for somebody who goes back to that era of tech because it's so rare to have an opportunity to talk about it.
It's
Did
cool. Yeah.
you run a BBS yourself?
I did, yeah, yeah. I called into BBSs. Then I was like, I want to run one, and then I was like, I want to write door games, and then I was like, I want to, write other software. So it was that kind of evolution.
Yeah, that's fun. It was we have overlapping paths there, right? I talk about how I got into cybersecurity, and if I tell the slightly longer story, I start here, and really back then it was just about being nerdy with computers, right? It was the more interesting thing at that time in computing, a multi-user system, super vulnerable. So it was like, can you build the better system to keep somebody from hacking into it? If not for fun, I mean, it wasn't always malicious back then.
Oh yeah.
So so the origin story is a lot of fun, and I could talk about this forever, but let's fast forward a little bit. And you've built and founded a few companies in your history. I believe you told me six, but I want to talk a bit about the company you helped scale and sell, BuildFacts. Tell us about that journey.
Yeah. I had started a company that built software for building departments. And I really didn't enjoy selling software to local government, but I was very interested in the data that building departments had. And so I think in about 2001, I thought about, hey, there's this sort of property Carfax thing we could make from building permits that give you like a history of changes to a property. And so that it sort of there was a circuitous journey, and then eventually in 2008, I founded BuildFacts, and it was really two things that interested me a lot in the founding of it, and I'll tell you why I think these are like a terrible base on which to start a company. I mean, if I could go talk back to myself, I would have like some very specific different advice. But I was really interested in there was this data set of building permits that no one had really aggregated effectively, and it felt like it would be useful information. And the other thing was that there was an interesting technical problem in it, which was here's all this data that lives in all these different locations, in all these different computer systems, and it's structured differently in those systems. So it's in different databases in different ways, but then also sometimes you can't get a copy of the database, and so when you make an open records request, you get like a PDF or a Word document, or you get an export from a database that's badly formatted. And so it's all the same type of information, but it's all in different containers. And how do you effectively like pull that information and mine what's common and build, one core definitive database out of it? And so we built what we called at the time a PEDAL for pragmatic extract, transform, and load. which was actually like, which was really building an extract, load, and transform. And so a lot of what we did at that point is now like the standard de facto way you would, you work within like DBT, for example. Everything we built there was that the same philosophy that happens today, but except, sort of 10 years before anyone was writing anything or talking about like, specifically like this is how you would process this type of problem. So that was a fun problem. And it was a data set that hadn't been aggregated, but we never set out to solve anyone's problem. We set out to collect something and figure out who wanted to buy it. And I just would never start a company that way again because it took so long to actually build the products out of it. And we were never close enough to our customers. We just never close enough to and so it took us forever to learn things that would have been very obvious if we had been much more customer centric.
Hmm. I love that you bring that up. I think in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, accelerators and stuff, we talk about that a lot, but it's not as commonly shared as a founder journey. The book on my desk here, the blue one down here, Lean Startup, talks all about it. And
Yeah.
I guess how I like to think about it is it a hobby, right? Are we building LordNet or are we building a business, right? And well, customers are going to win one way or another. Do we want to win with them? So
Yeah.
you got some scale and exited. What did that look like?
it wasn't like a glorious thing because the history of the company was long. And actually, this was part of the complexity is the company that we actually built BuildFacts into was from a corporate standpoint the same company that we had done the billing department software for. And there were a lot of liquidation preferences that sat on top. And so in that transaction, there was not like a huge pot of gold
Hmm.
as doing that. And so really, and that was, partly that was I could have advocated more for myself. I mean, it's funny, like that company never would have existed without me. It never would have made its profitability without me. It never would have sold without me. But in the end, the cap table and the structure of how the equity was really wasn't set up to reward me in the way that like I would assign, that. So it shaped a lot about what I thought about things. And in fact, I really stepped aside from the company when I realized that it wasn't, I stayed on to help and consult, but I realized that the owners just were not interested in fair allocations of equity and reward. And so certainly changed the way I thought about a lot of things. And one of the things that's interesting is around about the time that that I stepped away from BuildFacts, I helped a friend start a company that started. It took probably more than a year to get the first revenue in that company. But a software company, software as a service company, and that took no outside investment and is just purely bootstrapped. And that company, I got a lot of respect for that build and like how effective it was. It took way longer for it being bootstrapped and doesn't have like enormous ambitions,
Hmm.
but watching that play through, you always have to know the rules of the game you're in, and you gotta partner and work with people who are the people you want to partner and work with. And I think it's very easy, when you're taking outside capital, especially when you haven't done it before, to make choices in who you're working with that you'll regret.
Hmm. So many lessons in what you just shared. It's I think there's a lot to be said for having a founder's mindset, and not to suggest you weren't, but getting a job with equity is way different than being a founder. And in the end, the cap table is what susses it out, right? And On the VC side, well, VC can make a huge impact if it will help accelerate the business. And it sets a specific path too, right? Funds have life cycles. They have investors. They're accountable to their customers. So joining a fund effectively in their portfolio sets a life cycle for your company. And I think we should talk about that more in founder circles. If you walk in the right room, sometimes you hear this story, but it's usually after some hard knocks, right?
I mean,
And
yeah, I also think like one of the things I think is very true that I was told once is that if you ever want to understand what's happening with any investor, you need to understand. It's like always fund dynamics. Like whatever's happening, whatever conversation you're having at any time, it's about that investor's fund dynamics. And like sometimes you can't understand them, or sometimes you understand them after the fact, and you're like, that's why that person was acting that way. And so I think the sooner you can understand, yeah, this is true across the board in everything. If you don't understand what it's like to do that other person's job, if you don't have that empathy for that person, like you can't really know why they're doing anything. And we tend to impute these things to ourselves. Like there's this part of like children, like young children, if their parents get divorced, they tend to like, they generally have this feeling of like, I must have done something to have caused this divorce, right? It must be a result of me. And I think that's a mechanism that all humans have where we don't want to think that like we're going through life and like things are just happening to us that we don't have control over. Like we'd much rather prefer that we did something wrong to cause some bad outcome than we were going along fine and some bad thing happened to us that we had no control over and nothing we could have done would have stopped it. I think most people would prefer that first belief of agency, even if it's not true. But I do think that there's a tremendous amount. Certainly, if you need additional capital, and venture is great. I mean, I love venture. I love venture. I love private equity. I love, basically every aspect of capital markets and finance like serves a purpose, and there are great people doing all of them, and they're very useful. And I've used, most of them at this point in time. Uh, but I think that it's way too common in entrepreneurship to not understand what that job is and who you're getting money from and how their job and brain works and like how they're being judged. And if you don't understand those things, you're just going to be constantly surprised, and usually not in a good way, about what's going on.
empathy can be a superpower. Two fantastic boards or books on this subject from different angles. Venture funding, I believe, is one. I'll double check that. And startup boards, both fantastic books that are some of the most useful textbooks one can imagine when it comes to this sort of work. Well, let's fast forward to the present. You took all these lessons and you founded and started building Branch Insurance. What did you do differently with Branch starting out from all the hard knocks before?
Yeah, one of the things that I one of the most painful lessons that I've learned through starting companies, and I've started companies that have been acquired into other companies. I've become like a CIO. I've been a consulting CIO, CTO. I've done a couple digital transformations, and one of the things that became very painful to me, especially through those transformations, is that there is no continuing education in tech. And what this means is that in general, talented, experienced executives do not know modern ways of doing things, and in fact tend to be overly skeptical of them and tend to avoid them at the detriment of their organizations. Simultaneously, less experienced, but newer to tech. So not necessarily in age, but like someone more at the beginning of their career in tech is actually much more likely to have exposure to modern tooling that's great, and that lets you do wonderful things. But they lack the experience to know, oh, you know, this innovation is going to be bad. Like this is going to lead to bad outcomes. We should not do it. And versus people who have a reaction, so the experience is valuable, but the new tech is valuable. And what I knew was in starting Branch, I knew that if I hired senior, experienced technical people, they wouldn't do the things the way I wanted to do things at Branch. At Branch, we built fully serverlessly. We only have like one developer role. It's just developer. Every developer actually is a full stack developer, although we generally hire front end developers and we teach them what they need to for the back end, because the back end work is relatively simple based upon a bunch of other choices we've made. I'll make one like highly technical observation about a choice we made here that I think is really important. So the way most companies design software is they have a database. They have like a SQL Server or Postgres or something, and they do what they call normalizing their data structure. So there's a certain way that you want to like stick that data structure in. And so, for example, you might have an address table, and that's where all the addresses are going to go. And then in every other place you have an address, you just like say, oh, here's an address, here's a pointer to the address table. So you have this normalization. Then you have backend code that has to pull that data out of the database and put it into usable structures, usually through something called an ORM or object relational mapper. Then you're going to have an API. Well, the API is going to have to define data structures, often need to be a little different from how the ORM has them. And then you're going to have a front end that's going to consume the API, and that's going to have data structures too, and it might match the API, maybe not. So what is likely to happen is the data that you have is in this structure, transformed to API, transformed to the backend, transformed back to the database. And because these are different skills, you need different people all along the way. So anytime you change anything, it's got to be a coordination of teams and just lots of room for bugs. And all of these transformations are painful. So one of the decisions I made in building Branch was I said, we're gonna use GraphQL. A lot of people don't like GraphQL. A lot of people think GraphQL is like a fad technology that showed up 6 years ago and is dead. GraphQL was built for a particular reason. That one I don't care about. What I do care about GraphQL is GraphQL basically defines a database, defines an API by a database schema. So it says, this is what it looks like. Here's how the data looks like. And it's in the middle. And what's awesome about that is that that's the same data that's in the front end. It's the same data that's in the back end. And if you store it in a database that stores like documents, it's the whole record in the back end database. No transformation. So suddenly, it's easy to have a full stack developer because the data structure gets defined here and it's all the way the same all the way across. I knew though, if I hired some senior developer into this, and I hired 80% chance they would have thrown it out. Because there isn't that focus. So that change of like, how do you build without hiring senior people because you want to do things in a modern way? That was a very different thing in Branch. It was probably the biggest challenge in building the tech team.
I love that. It was such an interesting story. And we've been doing this sort. It's not been very long, but we've been doing this sort of tech for over 20 years now. Like late 90s, really early aughts is when we started doing large scale distributed computing, at least over the web. The thing is, there is no single pattern. Relatively tenured book now, Web Operations. It explores different architectures. There is no single one. A blog called High Scalability has many examples too. And I love what
Yeah.
your story illustrates is what we're doing still isn't a solved problem. And there are a lot of different ways to do it.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think that it's interesting on the data side, I think we have more of a solved problem. I think that we've gotten a lot closer to using software development practices to build like data warehouse data practices, the medallion, like bronze to silver to gold way of handling data. It's just like a simpler context, simpler domain. And I think we've got in there like some very clear ways of like, this is how you do it. There's a lot of consensus. I think probably the only dispute I see today are people who if you can get it all in SQL, you use dbt. If you can't, if you got some unstructured stuff or some painful stuff, you use PySpark. But like other than that, like there's this like clear stack of like how people like to do this. And you're totally right that on the software dev side, we're so far from that. There's just nothing that is in any way consensus at all. And in fact, we have these, the world is so muddy. We've got, David Heinemann Hansen, DHH, the creator of Ruby on Rails, is standing up, in sometimes obnoxious ways, but in sometimes very, thoughtful and empathetic ways. He seems to change on a daily basis. A really strong defense of this, like database ORM, like very, very much like a 2010 version of building software. And he's got a lot. There are a lot of people who who is very skeptical of the cloud and thinks you should run stuff on bare metal in a data center. And that there are a lot of people who find his viewpoint very compelling. I mean, I just think he couldn't be more wrong about where we're going. But I certainly wouldn't deny that there's probably a majority of software architects who agree with that.
Well,
So
when we started thinking one text solves most problems is generally how we fail or get jokes like MongoDB is web scale. Document stores have their place, but web scale, not so sure. Um, Along those lines, you referenced the prototypical corporate tech exec and how they're resistant to change when they at one point might have been driving the change. You're not new to your career by any means, Joe. How do you keep fresh? How do you keep yourself from getting set in your ways?
I think that I think that the most important thing is how you self-identify, right? And so I think if you had a scale from like, I mean, like what we're talking about is growth mindset, basically, right? So if you had a scale from growth mindset all the way back to like, like totally static mindset, like this would be my job title is Oracle DBA and I work on Oracle databases. Like that's a great example, I think, of someone who is just, and by the way, anybody who hires someone into a job position title like Oracle DBA, like that's just a terrible way to shoot yourself in the foot. Like you shouldn't tie someone's self-identity to some vendor. It should be about some business problem or some capability. So I think that the way to get more growth is to have more self-identity in I learn how to do new things. What I am trying to optimize for is today, if I were doing something from scratch, I would have the best way, I would know the best way to do it. Or today, if I needed to do this thing, of all the technologies out there, I could give a breakdown of why this one over this one and why probably this one over this one. And so more of my self-identity is much more in that than an identity, which I think a lot of senior tech people have, which is in look at all these things that I built and look how great they are and celebrate their greatness. And I think you have to be willing to throw out the thing you did yesterday, because we do keep making improvements. One practice that I've adopted and most specifically at Branch is everything we build, we give a generic name. So like our mobile app is called Account Mobile. And the website that we have, the application that our customers go to get information on their insurance policies is called Account. Account Mobile. the goal is not to give it like, we could give it a cutesy name like it's Canopy, we're Branch, we think about trees, and like we could like make Canopy shirts and like people could be on Team Canopy. But like that would mean that if we get to a point in time where we're like, we need to throw that thing away, it's crap based on what we can do now, it's gonna be really hard. I mean, a lot of people have a self-identity in Canopy. Um, Nobody has a self identity in account mobile. It's like, and we rewrote the whole thing from scratch, like 18 months ago because we got tired of a bunch of the issues with React Native. So, I think it's this question of like what are you optimizing for? Where do you seek your identity? And make sure that's aligned with something that puts you on the trajectory you want to be on.
Yeah, I like that learning mindset. Um, Cattle, not pets, right?
Yeah.
Co-opting from DevOps culture and practices. And one of the reasons why one of my company values is we're always learning. I was joking at a cybersecurity reception last week that folks who are stuck in their technology ways instead of changing moved over to security, right? Rooms in tech have moved faster than others.
It's a lot easier to in security. It is a lot easier to go slower, I think, with those things. Yes.
Well, one of the things I like about security, right? If we're doing it well, we move faster. I've been advocating for automated SDLCs, CI/CD, automated testing, as opposed to manual deployment processes for a really long time. And at one point, I was the stick in the mud, but the thing is, it's better security and it's faster speed to market. So we don't have to debate about that as often, but many of our organizations are still doing things manually, saying they're more secure, and they're simply not.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, anytime people are involved, it's less secure than if you can sort of test it out. One of the the great things about using all these well documented managed services for doing everything is that they're well documented, and they have like practices, and so you never have these questions. But yeah, we when we started Branch, we started zero trust because we didn't, and we've never had an internal network. And it's been great, but we have run into we've had like partnership deals we've needed to do where they need us to attest to like security practices, and they'll have requirements around like you have to have a DMZ that is like this and like this and like this. And so like I've done things like stood up like a DMZ in Amazon Web Services and set it up and like snapshot it, took did my audit on it, documented it, signed that piece of paper, and then took it all down. Like, there's a lot of people, certainly security, and I mean it has parallels in development, have focused more on the controls than on that. Like it's just like no, you just need these controls as opposed to asking like what are the threats, right? And this happens everywhere that people want these proxies for these shortcuts, right? Well, as long as you're doing these things, it must be okay, as opposed to the better, harder work of like, help me understand the situation, and then help me understand, and then from that situation, let me think about where the risks are, right? And let's make a plan based upon the actual risks that are here, and and testing around those actual risks. But the majority of people are much more likely to sort of say, does it have this shape? Does it have this heuristic? Okay, well then that means it's good or bad. I think it's a real challenge in everywhere, especially when you're getting audited by a potential customer who has these requirements around controls, and you're like, that control doesn't make sense for us. Let's talk about the risk.
Yeah, I often do my best to negotiate those things away, and worst case scenario, make them pay for it, right? But
Yeah, yeah. My
ultimately, if the business supports it, meaning they'll pay for it in some form, and it doesn't set us backwards, well, maybe we
One,
work around it.
I was an interim CIO for a company that had sold to small banks and was trying to sell to the largest banks in the country. And so it was my job to get them ready and to pass those security audits. And we did, and they sold to I think like 9 of the top 10 banks in the U.S. are their customers now. And it only took us about 12 months to get them in shape for it. But the thing that drove me nuts was the auditors would come in and would say, you have to you allow Facebook on your employee computers in the office. And it was like everyone was required to be in the office all the time. Um, and they were like, that's a risk. And it was like, well, what's the risk? And they're like, well, it's data exfiltration risk through like Facebook, like chat or something. And like, there were a million ways to like deal with that exfiltration risk other than like stopping people from being able to access Facebook on company computers. And this isn't like the employee benefit fight to end all employee benefit fights, but I felt really strongly that that was really an unnecessary requirement, and it just wasn't really addressing the risk that this guy was really concerned about. And but the CEO was like wanted to do all the deals, so he caved on everything. And so once all those deals were done, like you couldn't you get like every website you had to visit was like on some whitelist. And so like no one, I mean, the productivity like dropped off a cliff, but you know.
Yeah, that's the beauty of modern tech companies, right? Endpoints, I almost never care about because we're not storing or processing data on the endpoints. Our computers, well, if they get ransomware, it affects one computer, not our entire network.
Yep. Yeah.
And well, our computers are working with our technology, but that zero trust premise where they're going through the same security mechanisms to get to it. If they're accessing the same website, if our business operation folks are accessing the same website we're building, our computer isn't any more special. And
Yeah.
we just get stuck in this checkbox mentality. And
Yeah.
why it's so important to have a peer at that executive level who can talk business and get in the conversations at the right stage, because getting too deep in that tactical process with tacticians, it's very difficult to walk back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, cool. I think we're nearly out of time here. Anything you'd like to share in closing thoughts, closing comments?
The one thing I'd say is on my journey, one of the things that made the biggest difference to me was I was sent to an incubator as part of I joined a private equity firm to be a consulting CIO, CTO, interim CIO, CTO for their companies, and they decided that they would incubate a new venture and that I would run that venture. And so I got sent to Silicon Valley, Redwood City for 12 weeks in an incubator with a number of kind of random people, I would say, and then facilitators there. And so I got to have my own kind of little, I mean, not specifically because I haven't done like a Y Combinator or Techstars or anything. And I haven't generally been through those incubators. But the uh, throughout those 12 weeks, I had to fight my impulse to want to build. I just want to build. I just want to let me build this thing. And the push that came from the incubator was you got to keep doing interviews, keep doing interviews. And there were a couple of mentors from IDEO who were like, here's how you're going to like go from like market to participants to problems to solutions. And like, here's what it's going to look like. And here's you're going to talk to people. And I probably did like 500 interviews, which is just and it's an absurd amount of things because when you decide to start doing interviews, the number of people you interview who will flake out, won't show up, aren't the right person, like you don't get a high hit rate on this stuff when you're starting out. But that experience, and then while during that experience, being like, okay, now I'm going to build. So I do interviews. I'm like, okay, now I know what we need, and we'll build it. And I threw away 100% of everything there, because every subsequent interview got me kind of closer to what was needed, but I just wasn't ready. So we did that for 12 weeks, did interviews for another 6 months, and then finally got funding. And as soon as we got funding, we built a product in about 10 weeks, and we had revenue in the first week of launch. And we were like on a path to profitability in less than 6 months. And so it was such an amazing eye opener, like contrast to let's build facts. Here's a bunch of data. Here's a cool technical problem and a bunch of data that's never been aggregated. We'll go find people to buy it, and then really take like 4 or 5 years to get to consistent revenue. To what we were able to do in this incubator and out of it, and so that it really changed a lot about how I thought about doing things. And I still see out in the world, I see like lots of versions of my 20 something self who have the view of like, well, I can develop software and these other people can't. And so I'm specialer and better. And I bet I could do their jobs better than them. Like that's who I was in my early 20s, maybe mid 20s too. And the journey that I've been on since then and the sort of how to do this customer discovery. You mentioned Lean Startup. I think Lean Customer Discovery by Cindy Alvarez is one of my favorite books on that particular prospect. And she calls it customer discovery instead of product discovery as like as a specific choice. Like you're trying to discover your customers. So that to me was one of the most important experiences I had and really changed everything afterward.
Hmm. Love that story. And thank you for sharing it, Joe. Solve a real problem in the market and shoot revenue. Crazy
Yeah.
talk.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
And if you talk to people and they have a problem, then whatever solution's out there, well, they're not working for that person. Don't worry about those other solutions. Worry about the problem.
Mm, so true. And before I forget, the book I did not remember properly earlier is Venture Deals, Brad Feld.
Oh, I know
Great
that
book.
one very well. That's a great book. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, cool. Thanks so much for the time today, Joe. If anyone wants to follow up on anything you shared today, would you like to share any way for them to reach out to you?
Sure. Probably the most fun one is X or Twitter. I'm just Joe Emison there, and it continues to be a worse and worse website, but there's still some useful conversation happening on tech there. And then I'm also Joe at branch.com if you want to send me an email. But I like those public conversations, even as that website decays into chaos.
Follow Joe on the internet. Well, thank you all for your time today, and especially you, Joe. Really enjoyed the conversation. If you'd like to follow up on anything regarding cybersecurity or anything we've chatted today, feel free to reach out to hello@gammaforce.io. And stay tuned. We'll have another session next month. Take care.